The glass shattered before Eirwyn could pull her hand back. She stood frozen in the Luna's private chamber, crimson wine spreading across white marble like a wound opening in slow motion. The crystal goblet lay in pieces at her feet, and her fingers, still trembling from exhaustion, hovered in the air where the stem had slipped. Luna Mareth didn't move from her vanity. She continued brushing her hair with long, deliberate strokes, watching Eirwyn's reflection in the gilded mirror. "How clumsy," Mareth said softly. The kindness in her voice made Eirwyn's stomach turn. She dropped to her knees immediately, reaching for the shards. Her hands moved on instinct now after all these years. Apologize with action, not words. Clean the mess before it becomes a statement. Disappear into the background until the moment passes. Leave it. Eirwyn's fingers stilled an inch from the largest piece of glass. Hi viewers, have you ever broken something small and felt the weight of the world shift beneath you? Stand up. Look at me. Eirwyn rose slowly. Her legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She met Mareth's eyes in the mirror, ice blue, patient, almost maternal in their steadiness. "You've been distracted today," Mareth said, setting down her brush. She turned on the velvet stool, and the firelight caught the emeralds in her circlet. "3 times you've brought cold tea. Twice you've entered without knocking. And now this. I'm sorry, Luna. I didn't ask you to speak." Mareth tilted her head, studying Eirwyn the way one might examine a stain on expensive fabric. "Do you know what happens when servants become careless?" Eirwyn's throat closed. She knew. God, she knew. "They become examples," Mareth continued. "Not because I'm cruel, Eirwyn, but because standards exist for a reason. The Triplet Alphas trust me to maintain order in this household. If I allow sloppiness, what does that say about my ability to lead?" The logic was flawless. It always was. Mareth stood and crossed the room in 3 fluid steps. She stopped close enough that Eirwyn could smell lavender and something sharper underneath, like metal left too long in the sun. "Hold out your hands." Eirwyn's body obeyed before her mind could catch up. She extended both palms upward, fingers spreading automatically into the position she'd learned years ago. Mareth placed a single shard of glass in Eirwyn's right palm. "Squeeze." The word landed like a stone in still water. Eirwyn's vision blurred at the edges. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, could hear the wind rattling the shutters outside, could smell the wine still pooling on the floor. Everything sharpened and dulled at the same time. "You'll learn better with consequence," Mareth said gently. "I'm not angry, darling. I'm helping you remember." Eirwyn's fingers began to close. The glass bit into her palm, a thin line of fire that made her breath hitch. She didn't make a sound. Sounds made it worse. Sounds gave Mareth something to measure, something to withhold approval against until the lesson stuck. "Good," Mareth whispered. "You're learning." Blood welled between Eirwyn's fingers, dark and warm. She kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance, on a point just past Mareth's shoulder where a painting of the 3 alphas hung in gold frames. Braxen, Thorn, and Iskair, immortalized in oils, their expressions noble and untouchable. They'd been in the Great Hall tonight during dinner, 30 feet away, laughing at something a visiting alpha had said. Braxen's voice had carried across the room, deep and confident. Thorn had refilled his own glass rather than wait for a servant. Iskair had noticed when a younger pack member spoke out of turn and gently redirected the conversation. Good men, everyone said. Fair leaders. Strong protectors. They hadn't looked at Eirwyn once. "You can let go now," Mareth said. Eirwyn opened her hand. The glass shard fell and clinked against the marble, now slick with her blood. She kept her arm extended, palm up, waiting for permission to move. Mareth produced a white handkerchief from her sleeve and wrapped it around Eirwyn's hand with practiced efficiency. The pressure made the cut throb, but the bleeding slowed. "Clean the wine before it stains," Mareth said, returning to her vanity. "And bring fresh tea in 20 minutes. Not cold this time." "Yes, Luna." Eirwyn gathered the glass shards in the bloodied handkerchief, her movements careful and small. She poured sand over the wine stain from the jar kept near the hearth for exactly this purpose. The grains turned pink as they absorbed the liquid. Behind her, Marith began humming, a lullaby Eirwyn's mother had sung once, before designation and rejection had rewritten everything. Eirwyn swept the sand into a dustpan, hands shaking so hard the grains scattered. She steadied her wrist with her other hand and tried again. Better, cleaner, invisible. Oh, and Eirwyn? She paused at the door, dustpan balanced against her hip. Tomorrow the Alphas are hosting the Northern delegation. I'll need you closed during the afternoon meetings. Wear the gray dress, the one with long sleeves. Marith's smile reflected in the mirror, warm and terrible. We wouldn't want anyone getting the wrong impression. Yes, Luna. Eirwyn pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the corridor, breathing through her mouth because her nose had stopped working properly. The stone walls pressed in from both sides, lit by torches that flickered with every draft. Her hand pulsed beneath the handkerchief. The fabric was already soaked through. She'd started keeping count 3 years ago. Not of the punishments, those blurred together, justified and educational and necessary, but of the moments afterward. The seconds when she stood alone in hallways or storage rooms or her own narrow quarters and felt something harder than bones settling in her chest. Endurance, maybe, or strategy. She wasn't sure which yet. Eirwyn moved toward the servants' wing, footsteps silent on stone. Somewhere above, in the Alpha quarters, she could hear muffled laughter. A door opened and closed. Normal evening sounds in a household that functioned smoothly, where everyone knew their place. Her place was becoming someone who noticed things, like how Marith's punishments always escalated the day before important councils, how the Alphas praised her publicly for maintaining such a well-ordered household, how other servants had learned to avoid eye contact with Eirwyn entirely, not from cruelty, but from self-preservation. If they didn't see, they didn't have to choose. Eirwyn reached her room and locked the door. She unwrapped her hand over the wash basin. The cut wasn't deep. Marith was always careful about that. Nothing that would scar, obviously. Nothing that would raise questions during the brief medical inspections mandated twice yearly for household staff. She cleaned the wound with water from the pitcher, then tore a strip from an old undershirt and bound it tight. The gray dress for tomorrow hung on a peg by the window. Long sleeves, high neck, perfectly modest, perfectly concealing. Eirwyn sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands. 11 years. She'd been 16 when the Triplet Alphas had chosen Marith during the claiming ceremony. 16 when her name had been removed from the registry without explanation. 16 when she'd been assigned to serve the new Luna as an act of mercy. 27 now, and she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her a question that wasn't in order. But she remembered other things. She remembered that Councillor Davrin always argued for harsher trade tariffs after his third glass of wine. That Thorn favored his right leg slightly when it rained, an old injury he hid well. That Braxton's handwriting slanted left when he was tired. That a scare once stopped a heated debate by asking what the quietest person in the room thought, and everyone had looked around confused because they'd forgotten anyone else was there. Information collected dust in her mind like books in an abandoned library. Useless, probably, but hers. Eirwyn pulled a loose stone from the wall behind her bed and removed the leather journal hidden inside. The pages were filled with her small, precise handwriting. Dates, names, patterns. She opened to a blank page and wrote today's date, then 3 words, Northern delegation tomorrow. She didn't know why she was keeping records. She didn't know who they were for. But somewhere in the careful documentation of her own disappearance, she'd started to feel like her mind still belonged to her, even if nothing else did. Eirwyn replaced the journal and the stone, then lay back on the thin mattress. Her hand throbbed. The gray dress waited. Tomorrow she would stand behind Marith during the Northern meetings, silent and appropriate. She would pour wine without spilling. She would keep her eyes down. She would endure whatever correction came after, because there was always something after. And the Alphas would never look at her long enough to wonder why their Luna's favorite servant never smiled. That was the moment Eirwyn realized obedience would not save her, but she hadn't yet learned what would. What would you do if the people meant to protect you couldn't see you were drowning? The bruise bloomed purple-black across Eirwyn's ribs by morning. She pressed her fingers against it while standing in front of the cracked mirror in the washroom, testing the edges. The pain flared hot and immediate good. That meant she could hide it. Deep bruises stayed quiet. Surface ones showed through fabric. Last night's cut had sealed into a thin red line across her palm. She flexed her hand twice, working stiffness from the joints, then began dressing for the day. Gray dress first. The fabric was heavy, unadorned, designed to make the wearer forgettable. She fastened the buttons up to her collarbone, then pulled the sleeves down until they covered her wrists completely. Her reflection stared back. Pale skin, dark hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes that had learned to look without seeing. Perfect. She left her quarters before dawn, when the halls still held the blue-gray quiet of a household asleep. Her footsteps made no sound. Years of practice had taught her exactly where to step on each stone to avoid the slight echo that might wake someone. The kitchen was already alive with controlled chaos. Soraya, the head cook, barked orders at two younger girls who were kneading bread dough with flour up to their elbows. The fire roared in the massive hearth, and the air tasted like yeast and wood smoke. "You're early," Soraya said, without looking up from the pheasants she was preparing. Her hands moved with brutal efficiency, separating joints with a cleaver that sang against the cutting board. "Luna wants the delegation menu confirmed before breakfast," Eirwyn said. Soraya's mouth thinned. She was 50, maybe older, with iron-gray hair and hands scarred from decades of kitchen work. She'd been serving the Frostfall household since before Eirwyn was born. "Tell her the roasted root vegetables will be served with the third course, not the second. I don't care what the northern packs prefer. It's a textural issue." Eirwyn nodded and reached for the menu parchment on the side table. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked it up. She steadied it against her leg. Soraya's cleaver paused mid-swing. The older woman's eyes flicked to Eirwyn's hand, then away just as quickly. Her jaw tightened. She brought the cleaver down hard, severing the pheasant's wing with a crack that made both kitchen girls flinch. "Third course," Soraya repeated flatly. "Not the second." "Yes, ma'am." Eirwyn left before the silence could grow teeth. She'd seen that look before, on Soraya's face, on the other servants, on guards who stood outside the Luna's chambers during private corrections. Recognition without action. Sympathy without risk. What hurt most wasn't the punishment. It was how quickly everyone adjusted to it. The servant hallways were narrow and dimly lit, designed to keep staff movement invisible from the main house. Eirwyn navigated them from memory, one hand trailing along the cool stone wall. Her ribs protested with each breath. She'd learned early that Meritha's system had rules, unspoken but absolute. Rule 1, corrections were private, never in front of the alphas or visiting dignitaries. Rule 2, marks stayed hidden. Long sleeves, high collars, careful positioning during the twice-yearly medical inspections. Rule 3, justification always existed. Eirwyn was clumsy, distracted, slow to learn. The Luna was patient, educational, invested in improvement. Rule 4, no one intervened, because if they saw nothing, there was nothing to see. Eirwyn emerged into the main hall just as sunrise broke through the eastern windows. Light slanted across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Tapestries depicting Frostfall's history hung along the walls. Battles won, treaties signed. The three alphas receiving their joint crown from the previous pack leader. She paused in front of that last tapestry. Braxton stood tallest in the center, broad-shouldered and steady. Thorn to his left, leaner but no less commanding. Isaiah on the right, watching the crowd with the kind of attention that missed nothing. They'd been 22 when they took joint leadership. 25 when they chose Merith. Eirwyn had been invisible before, but after the rejection, she'd become something worse, useful. "You're staring." Eirwyn spun. Kale, one of the younger guards, stood 3 feet away with his arms crossed. He was maybe 19, still growing into his uniform, with the kind of earnest expression that hadn't been beaten out of him yet. "I'm sorry," Eirwyn said automatically. "I was just... doesn't matter." But his eyes were kind. "Delegation arrives in 2 hours. Luna wants the receiving room checked." "I'll go now." Kale nodded, then hesitated. His gaze dropped to her hand, the one wrapped in clean linen that was just visible at her wrist. Something shifted in his expression. "You should be more careful," he said quietly. Eirwyn's throat closed. "I will be." She hurried past him before he could say anything else. Kindness was worse than indifference. Kindness made you hope someone might actually do something. The receiving room smelled like beeswax and cold stone. Eirwyn lit the candles in the wall sconces, then checked that every chair was positioned exactly as Marith preferred. Angled slightly inward to create intimacy, spaced far enough apart to maintain hierarchy. The door opened behind her. "Good. You're here." Marith entered like weather, inevitable and atmosphere-changing. She wore deep blue today, with silver threading that caught the candlelight. Her blonde hair was arranged in an intricate series of braids that must have taken her personal maid an hour to complete. She looked beautiful. She always did. "The Northern Alpha is bringing his daughter," Marith said, inspecting the room with a critical eye. "She's recently presented as an Omega. He's looking for a favorable match." Eirwyn kept her expression neutral. "Yes, Luna. I want you visible during the afternoon session. Stand behind my chair. Keep the wine service flowing smoothly." Marith paused, studying Eirwyn the way one might study a chess piece. The Northerners respect propriety. They need to see that Frostfall runs efficiently. Translation: be perfect. Be silent. Be proof that Marith's household management was beyond reproach. "I understand," Eirwyn said. "Do you?" Marith moved closer, and Eirwyn fought the instinct to step back. "Because yesterday you seemed distracted, careless. And we discussed what happens when you're careless. It won't happen again." "No," Marith agreed softly. "It won't." She reached out and adjusted the collar of Eirwyn's dress, a gesture that might have looked maternal to anyone watching. Her fingers pressed against the bruise hidden beneath fabric. Not hard, just enough. Eirwyn's vision went white at the edges. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there while pain radiated through her entire right side. "There," Marith said, stepping back with a satisfied smile. "Much better. You may go prepare the tea service." Eirwyn walked to the kitchen on legs that felt borrowed. The bruise screamed with each step. She kept her breathing shallow, her expression empty, her hands steady as she assembled the silver tea service and arranged pastries on delicate china. Soraya watched from across the kitchen but said nothing. The morning bled into afternoon. The northern delegation arrived with appropriate ceremony. 6 wolves, including the Alpha and his daughter. Eirwyn stood in the receiving line with the other household staff, head bowed, while Braxon, Thorn, and Isker welcomed them formally. She caught fragments of the greeting. Thorn's laugh, warm and genuine. Isker's questions about their journey. Braxton's steady baritone outlining the afternoon's agenda. Not one of them looked at the staff. The meetings began at midday in the great room. Eirwyn took her position behind Marith's chair as instructed, a silver pitcher of wine in her hands. The weight made her ribs throb, but she held it steady. She watched the Alphas work. They were good at this, the performance of leadership. Braxton anchored every discussion with calm authority. Thorn injected warmth at exactly the right moments to ease tension. Isker listened with the kind of attention that made people feel heard. They were good men. That was the worst part. Because good men could still benefit from bad systems if they never looked closely enough to see them. Eirwyn refilled glasses when they emptied. She anticipated needs before they were spoken. She moved like a shadow, present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. Marith caught her eye once and smiled, proving, possessive. The afternoon stretched into evening. Discussions of trade routes and territorial agreements blurred together. Eirwyn's hands went numb from holding the pitcher. Her ribs felt like someone was driving nails between them with each breath. But she didn't waver, didn't falter, didn't give Meredith any reason to schedule another correction. Finally, as the sun began setting, Braxton called for a recess before dinner. The northern delegation was shown to their guest quarters. The great room emptied, leaving only staff to clean up. Eirwyn set down the pitcher and began collecting empty glasses. Her hands shook now that no one was watching. "You did well today." She looked up. Isker stood in the doorway, still wearing his formal jacket. He was the quietest of the 3 alphas, easier to overlook, harder to read. "Thank you, Alpha," Eirwyn said. He studied her for a moment with those dark, assessing eyes. "You've been with the household a long time, haven't you? 11 years. That's impressive loyalty." He paused. "Are you happy here?" The question landed like a stone in her chest. Eirwyn's mind raced through possible responses. Truth was dangerous. Lies were obvious. She settled on something in between. "The Luna has been very instructive," she said carefully. Isker's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his gaze. He nodded slowly. "I see." He left without another word. Eirwyn stood alone in the great room, surrounded by empty glasses and the lingering smell of wine. Her reflection wavered in the polished table, a gray ghost with careful posture and hidden wounds. Isker had asked if she was happy. No one had asked her that in 11 years. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither. Just gathered the glasses onto a tray and carried them toward the kitchen, each step a negotiation with pain. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Eirwyn added a new entry to her hidden journal. Alpha Isker. Asked about happiness. Didn't know how to answer. Not sure he wanted the truth anyway. She closed the journal and stared at the gray dress hanging on its peg, already laid out for tomorrow. The Luna had been pleased with her performance today, which meant tomorrow would bring new tests, new corrections, new lessons in how to be useful without being visible. But something had shifted, small as a pinprick, sharp as glass. Someone had noticed her long enough to ask a question. It wouldn't save her. Eirwyn knew that, but it was the first time in years someone had acknowledged she was capable of an answer. Have you ever been asked a simple question that felt impossible to answer honestly? Eirwyn learned to mark time by scars instead of seasons. The thin white line across her left shoulder blade, winter, year 3. She'd been too slow refilling Meredith's breakfast tea, and cold hospitality reflected poorly on the household. The lesson had come later, in the privacy of the Luna's chambers, delivered with a letter opener and patient explanation. The cluster of circular marks along her lower back, spring, year 7. She'd laughed at something another servant said. Not loudly, just a brief, unguarded sound that had carried into the hallway where Meredith was passing. Omegas didn't draw attention to themselves. The correction had involved heated coins and a lecture about appropriate emotional displays. The deep tissue bruising along her ribs that never fully healed. Autumn, year 9. She'd made eye contact with Thorne during a council session. Just for a second. Just long enough for him to nod in acknowledgement when she'd refilled his glass. Meredith had noticed. 11 years compressed into moments that left marks. Not all visible, not all physical, but Eirwyn remembered every single one. She stood now in the household library, shelving books that council members had left scattered across reading tables. Dawn light filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted like snow. The library was her favorite room in the keep. All leather-bound silence and the musty smell of old paper. It was also where she learned how power actually worked. Council members spoke freely here, assuming the Omega reshelving books was deaf, mute, or simply too stupid to understand political nuance. They were wrong on all counts. Eirwyn had been educated before her designation. Her tutors had praised her memory, her ability to synthesize information, her natural understanding of governance systems. That education had stopped abruptly at 16 when her designation made it irrelevant. But the skills remained. She'd spent 11 years listening to territorial disputes, trade negotiations, succession arguments, and alliance strategies. She knew which packs were in debt, which alphas were losing pack confidence, which treaties were held together by nothing but aging leaders' stubbornness. She knew Frostfall's political vulnerabilities better than most council members. Not that anyone asked. Eirwyn slid a volume on mineral rights onto the top shelf, using the rolling ladder to reach. Her shoulder protested. The old letter opener scar pulled tight whenever she raised her arm above her head. "You're up early." She nearly dropped the book. Cale stood at the library entrance, looking apologetic for startling her. "Just finishing yesterday's mess," Eirwyn said, climbing down carefully. Cale moved into the room, his guard's uniform crisp despite the early hour. He'd been with the household guard for 2 years now. Still young enough to believe rules existed to protect people rather than systems. "Council ran late again?" he asked, surveying the scattered books. "Until past midnight. Territorial dispute with the Eastern Ridge Pack." "Who won?" Eirwyn paused, then gave him the answer she'd constructed from overheard arguments. "No one yet. Ridge Pack wants access to the northern timber routes. Frostfall can't grant it without undermining the treaty with Snowmelt. Braxton proposed a 3-way negotiation, but that requires Snowmelt to come to the table, and they're still angry about last year's hunting boundary decision." Cale stared at her. "How do you know all that?" "I listen. Most servants don't." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "You pay attention to things." Eirwyn returned to shelving, keeping her back to him. "Helps to understand context. Makes service more efficient." It was a careful answer. True enough to satisfy, vague enough to avoid raising questions about why an Omega servant needed to understand complex political negotiations. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does the Luna know you're this observant?" Everything in Eirwyn went still. "I observe what I'm told to observe," she said evenly. "That's not what I asked." Eirwyn turned to face him. Cale's expression was troubled, the look of someone who'd noticed something but didn't yet understand what they were seeing. "The Luna values efficiency," Eirwyn said. "I'm efficient. That's all." Cale held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Right, of course." He left, but the tension he'd brought remained behind like smoke. Eirwyn finished shelving and returned to her quarters to change before breakfast service. She had 30 minutes before she needed to report to the kitchens. 30 minutes of time that belonged to her. She pulled out her hidden journal. The pages had multiplied over the years. Careful documentation of everything she witnessed. Council voting patterns. Which alphas respected Braxton's leadership versus tolerating it. How Thorne's easy charm masked serious political instinct. The way Iskair asked questions that exposed weaknesses in arguments without ever seeming aggressive. She recorded Maritha's patterns too. How punishments escalated before important councils. How the Luna's public persona, gracious, accomplished, devoted to the alphas, never wavered even as her private cruelty refined itself into art. Eirwyn didn't write about her own pain. That seemed self-indulgent, useless. But she wrote everything else. She opened to today's date and noted. Cale noticed observational skills. Potential risk. Monitor. Then she added. Eastern Ridge negotiations likely to stall. Snowmelt won't negotiate until Elder Rowan passes leadership to his daughter. Estimated timeline, 6 months. Council doesn't know this yet. She knew because she'd overheard Rowan's visiting nephew mention the Elder's failing health during a private conversation in this very library 3 weeks ago. The nephew had been speaking to his companion in their native tongue, assuming no one else understood it. Eirwyn's childhood tutors had taught her 5 languages before her designation made such education wasteful. She closed the journal and hid it again. The stone slid back into place seamlessly. In 11 years, no one had ever searched her room. Why would they? She was furniture. Useful, well-maintained, easily replaced. The thought didn't hurt anymore. Somewhere around year 8, she'd stopped feeling things that didn't serve a purpose. Breakfast service passed without incident. Eirwyn stood behind Meritha's chair in the informal dining room while the Alphas discussed the day's schedule. The northern delegation had departed yesterday. Today was administrative, reviewing petitions, settling minor disputes, approving expenditures. Boring, routine work that kept packs functioning. Thorn was telling a story about a petition from a farmer who'd requested compensation for crops destroyed by a pack member's shifted form during a hunt. His delivery was perfect, self-deprecating about the absurdity while still taking the farmer's concerns seriously. Braxton laughed, deep and genuine. How much did we approve? Enough to replant plus 10% for the inconvenience of bureaucracy, Thorn said. Seemed fair. You're too soft, Merit teased, touching his arm lightly. They'll start destroying their own crops for compensation. Let them try. I'll send a scare to investigate. Thorn grinned at his brother. No one lies to a scare twice. Isker smiled slightly but didn't look up from the document he was reading. Because I'm terrifying. Because you remember everything they said the first time. Eirwyn felt something twist in her chest. They were good together, the three of them, balanced. Braxton's steadiness, Thorn's warmth, Isker's precision. They genuinely cared about governing well. They just didn't look at the mechanisms that made their governance possible. Eirwyn, more coffee for Alpha Thorn, Merit said without turning around. Eirwyn moved immediately, lifting the silver pot from the sideboard. She circled the table and refilled Thorn's cup with practiced efficiency. Thank you, he said absently, still focused on his conversation with Braxton. 2 words. Automatic politeness. He'd forget he'd said them in 5 minutes. But they were 2 more words than he'd said to her in the previous 6 months. Eirwyn returned to her position. Meritha's hand found hers under the table. A brief squeeze that looked affectionate. The pressure hit directly on yesterday's cut. Eirwyn's vision blurred. She kept her breathing steady, her expression neutral. The pain lasted 3 seconds. Then Merit released her and returned to her breakfast as if nothing had happened. The Alphas never noticed. Later that afternoon, Eirwyn stood in the council chamber, refilling water glasses while Braxton heard petitions. A young wolf was requesting permission to establish a new smithy in the lower district. Braxton listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions about zoning and fire safety, then approved the petition with suggestions for guild registration. Fair. Thorough. Just. Eirwyn wondered what he'd think if he knew his Luna used the same letter opener he'd gifted her for correspondence to teach Omega servants about appropriate behavior. Probably nothing, because knowing would require seeing, and seeing would require caring enough to look past the surface of a well-run household. That evening, Eirwyn knelt in Meritha's chambers, organizing the Luna's extensive jewelry collection. Each piece had to be cleaned, catalogued, and returned to its designated spot in the velvet-lined cases. Merit sat nearby, reading letters from other Pax Lunas, correspondence about fashion, events, the exhausting performance of leadership. The Silver Pine Luna is hosting a summer gathering, Merit said. She's invited the regional Lunas. 3 days of absolute tedium disguised as networking. Eirwyn said nothing. She wasn't expected to. Of course I'll attend. Appearances matter. Merit set down the letter. You'll come as well. I'll need someone competent to manage my wardrobe and schedule. Eirwyn's hands stilled on a sapphire necklace. 3 days. Away from Frostfall. In a different Pax territory, surrounded by other Lunas and their households. Yes, Luna, she said. Don't sound so terrified. I'm not bringing you as punishment. Meritha's voice softened into something almost kind. You've been performing well lately. Consider it exposure to how other households operate. Educational. Like, thank you, Luna. You may go. Eirwyn retreated to her quarters and collapsed on her bed without bothering to undress. Her body ached in the specific way that meant tomorrow would hurt worse than today. Old injuries layering over older ones, creating a map of endurance written in scar tissue and compromised healing. She stared at the ceiling and let herself acknowledge what she normally kept buried. She was 27 years old. She'd spent 11 years learning to disappear while simultaneously learning everything about how power functioned in Frostfall. She could recite territorial boundaries, succession laws, trade agreements, and political alliances with more accuracy than most council members. And none of it mattered, because information without agency was just another cage with clearer walls. Eirwyn pulled out her journal one last time before sleep. She wrote, "Silverpine gathering in 6 weeks. Marith bringing me. Opportunity? Unknown. Monitor." Then she wrote something she'd never written before. I didn't know then who these records were for. She stared at the words for a long time before closing the journal. Somewhere in the main house, the Alphas were finishing their evening. Thorn would be in his study handling correspondence. Braxton would be reviewing tomorrow's council agenda. Isker might be in the library, reading about something that caught his curiosity. Good men. Fair leaders. Strong protectors, who'd never once asked why their Luna's favorite servant moved like someone expecting violence. Eirwyn hid the journal and let herself sleep. Tomorrow would bring new corrections, new lessons, new moments to document. And she would endure them all with the same careful silence that had kept her breathing for 11 years. Power doesn't notice you when it benefits from your silence. But silence, Eirwyn was learning, could be its own form of record-keeping. She just didn't know yet what those records would cost, or what they might buy. What would you keep track of if no one knew you were paying attention? Eirwyn first understood the difference between justice and mercy when she watched Braxton defend a packless wolf accused of theft. The hearing happened on a cold morning in late autumn, year 8. The accused was young, maybe 19, with the kind of hollow-eyed desperation that came from sleeping rough and eating once every 3 days. He'd stolen bread from the market. Just bread. 2 loaves, already going stale, from a vendor who'd thrown away more food than that in a week. The vendor demanded punishment. Theft was theft. Laws existed for a reason. Braxton had listened to both sides with the same careful attention he brought to every petition. Then he'd spoken directly to the young wolf. "You're packless," Braxton had said. "Not a question." "Yes, Alpha. By choice or circumstance?" The boy had hesitated, clearly unsure which answer would hurt less. "Circumstance. Explain." And the boy had, haltingly miserably, described losing his family to illness, traveling south looking for work, getting turned away from pack after pack because he had no references, no skills, no connections. Braxton had turned to the vendor. "You've been compensated?" "The bread was worth." "I asked if you've been compensated. Yes or no?" "Yes, Alpha." Braxton had nodded. Then he'd offered the packless wolf a choice. 30 days of community service working in the pack's communal gardens, with meals and temporary housing provided. Or he could leave Frostfall territory immediately and be barred from returning. The boy had chosen service. Of course he had. Eirwyn had watched the whole thing from her usual position behind Maritha's chair. She'd seen Braxton's expression. Genuinely concerned, genuinely trying to balance law with compassion. He was good at it. That evening, she'd received correction for standing with poor posture during the hearing. Marith had noticed her watching too intently. Watching implied opinions. Opinions implied thoughts above her station. The punishment had been brief, effective, designed to remind her that observation was a privilege, not a right. But Eirwyn had kept watching anyway, more carefully, more strategically, and over the years, she'd assembled a complete picture of the 3 Alphas who ruled Frostfall. Braxton was the foundation, steady, principled, impossible to shake. He believed in systems, in laws that applied equally, in tradition as a form of shared memory, in fairness as something you built deliberately rather than stumbled into. He was also the one least likely to question whether the systems themselves needed examination. If something functioned smoothly, Braxton saw no reason to dismantle it. The household ran efficiently. Marith was an exemplary Luna. Staff performed their duties. Everything worked. Why look for problems that weren't visible? Thorn was different, warmer, more intuitive about individual circumstances than systemic issues. He remembered names, asked about families, noticed when pack members seemed troubled. But his kindness was personal, not political. He'd spend an hour talking with a grieving widow about her late husband, but it wouldn't occur to him to question why she had no legal claim to the property they'd built together. He saw people. He missed patterns. And Isker was complicated. He was the quietest of the three, the most observant. Where Braxton trusted systems and Thorn trusted instinct, Isker trusted information. He asked questions that exposed assumptions. He noticed inconsistencies. He remembered details others forgot. But his intelligence was analytical, not empathetic. He could map every political current in the region, but he struggled to understand why someone might lie about being hurt. If you didn't report pain, Isker assumed it didn't exist. Eirwyn had categorized all of this over years of silent observation. She knew which alpha to serve wine to first based on who was having the hardest day. She knew when to stay invisible and when strategic visibility might benefit someone else. She'd become an expert in powerful men who meant well. And she'd learned that good intentions without attention were just another form of harm. Today, she was cleaning the Alpha's private study while they worked elsewhere. The room smelled like leather and ink and the cedar oil used to polish the massive desk that dominated the space. She dusted shelves lined with books, governance theory, military strategy, pack law, regional history. Many showed wear from actual reading. These weren't decorative. A folder lay open on Braxton's desk. Council notes, probably. She shouldn't look. She looked anyway. The notes were about the Silverpine gathering, the one Marith would be attending in 5 weeks. Braxton had written observations about which Lunas would be there, which alliances might be worth strengthening, which political tensions needed careful navigation. His handwriting was precise, controlled. Every letter formed with care. At the bottom of the page, in Isker's sharper script, someone had added, "Ask Thorn to attend. His social instinct better than mine for this context." Below that, in Thorn's loose, confident hand, hard pass. "You two can suffer through fancy parties without me." And then Isker again cowered. Eirwyn felt something uncomfortably close to fondness. They were brothers in the truest sense, constantly negotiating who handled which responsibilities, trusting each other's strengths, comfortable enough to argue in margin notes. They cared about each other. They just didn't care about or notice the people who existed outside their immediate circle of concern. Find something interesting? Eirwyn spun. Isker stood in the doorway, watching her with those dark, assessing eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm sorry, Alpha. I was just dusting. I didn't mean to." "Read our notes." He stepped into the room. "You were reading them. There was no point denying it." "Yes." "Why?" "Because information was the only thing she owned. Because understanding how they thought was the only power she had. Because knowing who they were helped her predict what they'd miss." "I was curious," she said instead. Isker moved closer, and Eirwyn fought the instinct to retreat. He stopped a few feet away, studying her the way he might study a complex problem. "You're Maritha's personal attendant," he said. "You've been with the household. How long?" 11 years, Alpha. That's a long time." He paused. "Do you enjoy the work?" The same question he'd asked before, phrased differently. Eirwyn wondered if he remembered asking it the first time, or if her answer then had been so unmemorable he'd forgotten. "The Luna has high standards," Eirwyn said carefully. "Meeting them is fulfilling." "That's not what I asked. It's the answer I have." Something flickered across Isker's expression. Interest, maybe, or surprise that a servant would deflect rather than appease. "You read council notes when you think no one's watching," he said. "You pay attention during meetings. You understand political nuance." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because before designation erased her future, she'd been educated for exactly this kind of work. Because her mind hadn't stopped functioning when her social value had collapsed. Because intelligence didn't disappear just because no one wanted to acknowledge it." "I like to understand context," Eirwyn said. "It makes service more effective." "Effective," Isker repeated, tasting the word. "You're wasted as an attendant." Eirwyn's breath caught. "I serve where I'm needed, Alpha. He didn't look convinced. If you could do anything else, what would you choose? The question felt like a trap. But Ascare's expression was genuinely curious, and something about his attention, focused, patient, actually wanting an answer, made her reckless. Governance, she said. Policy analysis. Systemic evaluation. Ambitious. Theoretical. She straightened, meeting his eyes. I'm an Omega. I serve. Because you were designated that way? Or because it's all you're allowed to do? The question hung between them like a blade. Before Eirwyn could answer, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Maritha's voice carried clearly. Iscare? Are you in the study? Iscare held Eirwyn's gaze 1 second longer. Then he turned toward the door. Yes, just reviewing tomorrow's agenda. Marith entered, smiling. Perfect. I need your opinion on the Silverpine arrangements. She noticed Eirwyn and her smile warmed. Oh good, you're finishing in here. Come to my chambers when you're done. I need help selecting which gowns to bring. Yes, Luna. Maritha's hand found Iscare's arm, casual and possessive. Have you eaten? Thorn was saying something about a late lunch. They left together, Maritha's laugh echoing down the hallway. Eirwyn stood alone in the study, her hands shaking. If you could do anything else, what would you choose? No one had asked her that in 11 years. And Iscare had asked like her answer actually mattered. She finished dusting mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Then she went to Maritha's chambers as ordered. The Luna was in a good mood, always dangerous. Good moods meant elevated expectations. Small failures became larger disappointments. The blue silk or the silver brocade? Marith asked, holding up 2 gowns. The blue is more flattering, but the silver makes a stronger political statement. The silver, Luna. The Silverpine Luna favors bold displays. Maritha's eyes sharpened. How do you know that? Eirwyn kept her voice neutral. I overheard council members discussing her reputation. Clever girl. Marith set down the gowns. You're learning to think strategically. That's good. That's useful. She moved closer, and Eirwyn's body tensed automatically. Did you have an interesting conversation with Alpha Iscare? Marith asked softly. Everything in Eirwyn went cold. He asked if I was finished dusting, Luna. That's all. He seemed thoughtful when I arrived. Like you'd said something that caught his attention. I wouldn't know, Luna. Marith studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Of course not. You're far too well trained to presume importance. She turned back to the gowns, the moment passing. Pack the silver, and the sapphire necklace to match. We'll show Silverpine what Frostfall style looks like. Eirwyn packed the trunk while Marith discussed scheduling. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind kept circling back to Iscare's question. You're wasted as an attendant. The words shouldn't matter. They were observation, not offer. Curiosity, not concern. But they'd acknowledged something she'd spent 11 years pretending didn't exist. She was capable of more than she was allowed to be. That night, alone in her quarters, Eirwyn wrote in her journal. Alpha Iscare notices observation skills. Asked about alternative work. Marith suspicious. Increased risk of correction. Then she added, good men can still benefit from bad systems if they never question why the systems serve them. She stared at the words for a long time. Braxton, Thorn, and Iscare weren't villains. They were decent leaders who genuinely tried to govern fairly. They punished visible injustice. They cared about their pack. They just didn't see the injustice that functioned quietly, efficiently, invisibly. And invisible harm was still harm, no matter how well it was justified. Eirwyn closed the journal and hid it away. In 3 weeks, she'd attend the Silverpine gathering. She'd serve Marith perfectly, endure whatever corrections came, and return to Frostfall exactly as she'd left. But something had shifted. Iscare had noticed her, not as furniture, not as function, as someone capable of thoughts worth hearing. It wouldn't save her. Eirwyn knew that. But it was the first time someone with actual power had acknowledged she existed as more than a role. And that acknowledgement, small as it was, felt terrifyingly close to hope. Have you ever had someone see potential in you that you'd stopped believing existed? The world narrowed to the sound of breathing. Eirwyn stood in the council chamber, silver pitcher in both hands, watching the afternoon light fracture through leaded glass windows. The Northern Ridge delegation had arrived 2 hours ago. Negotiations about timber routes and territorial access had been circling the same arguments since lunch. She'd refilled water glasses 14 times. Her arms had stopped feeling attached to her body somewhere around refill 9. The voices blurred together, Braxton's steady baritone, the Ridge Alpha's sharper inflection, council members interjecting with legal precedents and historical context. Marith sat beside the Alphas, contributing occasional observations that steered conversations toward favorable outcomes. She was brilliant at this. Everyone said so. Eirwyn's vision wavered at the edges. She blinked hard, trying to focus. The pitcher felt impossibly heavy. Her ribs ached with each breath. Yesterday's correction for folding linens too slowly. The cut on her palm from 3 days ago had reopened this morning when she'd gripped a tray wrong. Small pains, manageable, familiar, except her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The 1847 treaty specifically prohibits unilateral access changes, Councillor Davern was saying. His glass sat empty in front of him. Eirwyn moved forward. Her legs felt distant, like she was operating them through complicated machinery. She lifted the pitcher. The council chamber tilted sideways. No, she was tilting. She tried to correct her balance, but the floor had developed opinions about geometry. The pitcher slipped. Water arced through the air in a crystalline spray, catching sunlight, beautiful and wrong. Then she was falling. Not dramatically, just a slow, inevitable collapse, like a building finally surrendering to structural damage. Her knees hit stone first, then her hands. The pitcher clattered somewhere to her left, spilling across marble in a spreading pool. Voices erupted around her, sharp, concerned, distant. Eirwyn tried to push herself up, but her arms had stopped taking orders. She knelt there, staring at the water reflecting fractured light, and felt her body make a choice her mind hadn't authorized. It gave up, just stopped. Stopped negotiating with pain, stopped pretending functionality, stopped holding together through sheer force of will. Her vision grayed at the edges. The council chamber receded. Someone's hands caught her shoulders before she could fall completely. The grip was firm, careful, smelled like cedar and something metallic. "Get the healer," a voice said. Braxton's voice, she thought, hard to tell through the static filling her ears. "Now," another voice added. Thorns, sharper than usual. Eirwyn wanted to apologize, wanted to stand up, retrieve the pitcher, finish service properly. Her mouth wouldn't form words. The hands shifted, lifting her. She felt herself being moved, carried, laid on something soft. The council room carpet, probably. Expensive weave, imported from the Eastern Territories. She'd cleaned wine stains out of it twice. "Eirwyn," that was Ascare's voice, close to her ear. "Stay with us. The healer's coming." She tried to nod. Managed a slight movement that might have been a nod or might have been a muscle spasm. Time did strange things, stretched and compressed. She was aware of activity around her. Rapid footsteps, urgent voices, the rustle of someone kneeling nearby. Everyone stepped back. A new voice ordered. Healer Nissa, older woman, no nonsense, had been with Frostfall for 30 years. "Give me room to work." Hands on Eirwyn's wrist, checking pulse. Fingers lifting her eyelids, examining pupils. Professional touches, impersonal. "When did she last eat?" Nissa asked. Silence. "Anyone? When did this girl last have a meal?" That was Marith, sounding concerned and confused. "She ate this morning at staff breakfast." "I'm certain of it." Eirwyn had eaten half a piece of bread. Her stomach had been too knotted for more. "Her pulse is weak. She's severely dehydrated and exhausted." Nissa's voice sharpened. "I need to examine her properly. Somewhere private." "Use the adjacent sitting room," Braxton said. "Whatever you need." Eirwyn felt herself being lifted again, carried through a doorway. The sounds of the council chamber faded. She was placed on something softer than carpet, a couch probably. "Can you hear me?" Nissa asked. Eirwyn managed a whisper. "Yes." "Good. I'm going to check for injuries. Just stay still." Hands began a systematic examination. Professional, thorough, pressing gently along her arms, her legs, her sides. The pressure hit the bruise on her ribs. Eirwyn's breath caught. She couldn't stop the small sound that escaped. Nissa went very still. "Where does it hurt?" "Ribs. Left side." "May I look?" Eirwyn wanted to refuse, wanted to insist she was fine, just tired, just clumsy. But her body had betrayed her past the point of useful lies. "Yes," she whispered. She felt Nissa unfastening the gray dress, carefully moving fabric aside. Cool air hit her skin, and then silence. The kind of silence that had weight, had texture. Eirwyn kept her eyes closed. She didn't need to see Nissa's expression to know what the healer was looking at. The inventory was written on her body like a chronicle. The deep bruise across her ribs, purple-black, spreading. The older bruises in yellow-green stages of healing. The thin white scars crisscrossing her back. The circular marks along her lower spine. The cuts in various states of closure. 11 years of careful correction, mapped in scar tissue and damaged skin. "Sweet mercy," Nissa breathed. Footsteps approached from the council chamber. "How is she?" Thorn's voice. "Don't," Nissa started. Too late. Eirwyn heard the exact moment Thorn saw. The sharp inhale. The footsteps stopping abruptly. "What?" His voice cracked. "What is this?" More footsteps. Braxton and Iskair, probably. She heard one of them curse. Quiet, vicious. "Everyone out," Nissa ordered. "Now." "This is a medical examination." "Those are..." Iskair's voice strained. "Those scars are... old, new, various stages of healing." "Yes." Nissa's tone could have cut glass. "Which is why I need privacy to complete my assessment." "Out." The Alphas retreated, but Eirwyn could hear them just beyond the doorway. Low voices, urgent. Nissa continued her examination in silence. She catalogued every mark, every injury. Her touches gentle, but her breathing increasingly sharp. Finally, she covered Eirwyn with a blanket and sat back. "Who did this to you?" Eirwyn opened her eyes. Nissa's face was carved from anger and sorrow in equal measure. "I'm clumsy," Eirwyn said. The lie was automatic, well-practiced. "I fall a lot. I'm not very coordinated." "Don't." Nissa's voice went soft. "Don't insult either of us with that." These are not accidental injuries. These are systematic, deliberate. Some of these scars are years old." Nissa leaned forward. "Who did this?" Eirwyn's throat closed. She'd never said it out loud. Never reported, never complained, never gave voice to what happened behind closed doors. Because reporting required believing someone would listen, would care, would act. "I can't," she whispered. "You can. And you need to. You don't understand. The Luna..." She stopped. Nissa went very, very still. "Marith did this?" Silence was its own answer. "For how long?" 11 years. Nissa stood abruptly, her professional composure cracking. 11. She turned toward the door. "Braxton, in here. Now." The 3 Alphas entered immediately. Their expressions ranged from horrified to sick to murderous. Thorn looked at Eirwyn, then away, like the sight physically hurt. Iskair's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Braxton's face was carved from stone. "Report," he said to Nissa. "Multiple contusions in various stages of healing. Scar tissue consistent with burns, cuts, and repeated trauma. Malnutrition, chronic sleep deprivation. Injuries spanning years." Nissa's voice could have frozen fire. "This girl has been systematically abused under your roof for over a decade." The words landed like blows. "Who?" Braxton asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Nissa looked at Eirwyn, waiting. This was the moment. The choice. Stay silent and survive, or speak and shatter everything. Eirwyn met Braxton's eyes. Luna Marith. The room exploded. Not with sound, with presence. The three Alphas' power flooded the space like a physical force. Alpha dominance unchecked, furious, barely controlled. Eirwyn flinched despite herself. "Stand down," Nissa ordered sharply. "You're terrifying her." They pulled back immediately, but the air still crackled. "Explain," Braxton said. His voice was too quiet, too controlled. So Eirwyn did. She explained the first correction. The second, the system of justifications. The rules about staying silent, staying marked in hidden places, staying useful. She explained 11 years of learning to endure because endurance was the only option given. She explained it clinically, without emotion, the way she'd learned to experience it. The Alphas listened in absolute silence. When she finished, Thorn was gripping the doorframe hard enough to crack the wood. Iskair had his eyes closed, jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Braxton stared at her like she'd rewritten everything he thought he knew about his own household. "Where is Marith now?" he asked Nissa. "In the council chamber, with the delegation. Get Eirwyn somewhere safe. Private quarters. Guarded." Braxton's voice went cold. "No one sees her until I say otherwise." "The delegation," Iskair started. "Can wait." Braxton turned toward the door. "We're ending this. Now." They left. Nissa helped Eirwyn sit up carefully. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Then we're getting you out of here. Come on." They made it into the hallway. Eirwyn could hear raised voices from the council chamber. Maritha's laugh, light and confused. "I don't understand. What's happened? Is the girl all right?" And then Braxton's voice, cutting through like a blade. "You're done." Eirwyn didn't hear the rest. Nissa guided her down a different corridor, upstairs, into a guest suite she'd cleaned 100 times but never entered as anything other than a servant. "Stay here," Nissa ordered. "I'm posting guards. No one gets in without my clearance." She left. Eirwyn stood alone in a room larger than her entire quarters, wrapped in a blanket, listening to her world and several floors below. The curtain had been pulled back, and she didn't know whether that meant freedom or something infinitely worse. What happens when the truth you've been hiding finally forces itself into the light? The council chamber doors slammed open. Eirwyn heard it from the guest suite. The crack of wood against stone, the sudden silence that followed. Nissa had left guards outside the door. Young wolves who wouldn't meet her eyes, who stood rigid with the tension of witnessing something they didn't understand but knew was catastrophic. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, and listened to her life fracture. Voices carried through the ventilation shafts. Maritha's first, confused, then defensive. "This is absurd. The girl is clearly unwell. She's prone to dramatics. Strip her title." Braxton's voice, absolute, final. "You can't possibly believe." "Now." Eirwyn closed her eyes. Downstairs, the machine was already moving. She knew how this worked, had documented it for years. When power was threatened, it protected itself with speed, with visible action, with performances of justice that satisfied witnesses without examining why no one had noticed before. Footsteps pounded through hallways. Doors opened and closed. The household was waking up to crisis. Nissa returned an hour later, her expression grim. The delegation's been sent to guest quarters. Councils suspended. Maritha's being held in the West Wing under guard. "How long?" Eirwyn asked. "Until formal charges are filed." Nissa sat beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Numb." "That's normal. Your body's in shock." She pulled out medical supplies. "Let me rebandage these cuts properly." Eirwyn let herself be tended to. Nissa worked in silence, her hands gentle but her mouth tight with anger. 11 years, Nissa finally said. "How did no one see?" "People see what benefits them to see. I examined you twice a year, mandatory staff inspections." She was careful. The marks were always hidden. Fresh injuries happened between examinations. Eirwyn paused. And I lied. Every time you asked if I was hurt, I said no. Because she trained you to. Because surviving required it. Nissa's hands stilled. I should have looked harder. You saw what you were allowed to see. That's how the system works. Below, something shattered. Raised voices. Marith screaming now, the careful composure finally breaking. They're taking her circlet, Nissa said quietly. Stripping her authority. She's fighting. Eirwyn felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just the hollow recognition that punishment was loud while accountability stayed silent. The guards outside shifted. One of them spoke. The Alphas are coming. Nissa stood. I'll give you privacy. Please don't. Too late. The door opened. Braxton, Thorn, and Iskair entered like weather, filling the space with presence and barely controlled fury. They looked at her. Really looked. And Eirwyn saw the exact moment they understood what they'd failed to see for 11 years. Thorn turned away first, shoulders shaking. Iskair's hands clenched and unclenched, useless. Braxton approached slowly, like she might bolt. He stopped 3 feet away. We didn't know, he said. His voice cracked. I swear to you, we didn't know. I know, Eirwyn said. That's not. He stopped. Started again. That's not good enough. We should have known. We should have seen. Iskair moved closer. What can we do? What do you need? Everything. Nothing. Time to reverse. A childhood that didn't end at 16. A body that didn't remember pain like a second language. I don't know, she whispered. Marith will face formal charges, Braxton said. Council trial. Exile at minimum. Possibly execution. Depending on. No. All 3 Alphas stared. No. Thorn repeated. Eirwyn stood, letting the blanket fall. She was still wearing the gray dress, partially unfastened, bruises visible. Execution makes her an anomaly, a monster. One bad Luna. She met their eyes. It doesn't fix why this was possible. It doesn't change the system that let it happen. Then what do you want? Iskair asked. Eirwyn took a breath that hurt her damaged ribs. I want to know what happens next. After the trial. After Marith is gone. She paused. Because punishment ends a story. I want to know if anything actually changes. Silence. Then Braxton did something she'd never seen in 11 years. He knelt. Thorn and Iskair followed immediately, 3 Alpha Kings on their knees before an Omega servant. Whatever you want, Braxton said. Name it. It's yours. And Eirwyn realized with sudden, terrible clarity that this was the most dangerous moment of all. Because what they were offering was power. And power, unexamined, just created new victims. If someone who hurt you was punished, would that be enough? Or would you want something more? The trial lasted 4 hours. Eirwyn wasn't required to attend. Nissa had advised against it. The Alphas had offered her the choice. She went anyway. The council chamber was packed. Wolves from across Frostfall, visiting delegations who'd been caught in the scandal, household staff who'd served alongside her for years. Everyone wanted to see justice. Eirwyn sat in the witness section, wearing a clean dress someone had brought from her quarters. Not gray. Blue. She couldn't remember the last time she'd worn color. Marith stood at the center in restraints, her blonde hair still perfect, her expression carefully neutral. The charges were read. Systematic abuse, prolonged cruelty, violation of Luna authority. The evidence was Eirwyn's body. Examined, documented, photographed by Nissa with clinical precision. Marith's defense was expected. The girl misunderstood correction for cruelty, her appointed advocate argued. Luna Marith maintained high standards. Perhaps her methods were harsh, but her intent was educational. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then Nissa took the stand. These injuries are not educational, she said, her voice carrying. They are systematic torture designed to leave minimal visible evidence. The burns are placed where clothing covers them. The cuts avoid major vessels. This is not discipline gone too far. This is calculated abuse by someone who understood exactly how to hide what she was doing. The murmurs turned angry. Braxton called for testimony. 3 other servants came forward, hesitant, terrified, but speaking. They described seeing Eirwyn's injuries, hearing sounds from Meritha's chambers, noticing how Eirwyn moved like someone expecting violence. "Why didn't you report this?" Thorn asked one of them. The servant, a woman named Kessa, looked at him with something close to pity. "Because reporting requires believing someone will listen, Alpha. And servants learn early that our word against a Luna's means nothing." The chamber went silent. Meritha's advocate tried to redirect. The Luna's household management was exemplary. The Alphas themselves praised her efficiency. "Because we didn't look past the surface," Isker cut in. His voice was quiet but sharp as broken glass. "Because a well-run household convinced us everything was fine. That's our failure, not her defense." The deliberation took 30 minutes. Guilty on all charges. Meritha's face finally cracked. "You're making a mistake. I maintained order. I kept that girl useful when she was nothing." "Enough," Braxton said. The sentence was immediate. Exile. Permanent. Merith would be stripped of all titles, all property, all pack affiliation. She would leave Frostfall territory by dawn and never return. The crowd erupted in approval. Eirwyn sat very still and felt absolutely nothing. Guards escorted Merith out. She fought them, screaming about injustice and betrayal and ungrateful servants. Her voice echoed through the chamber until the doors closed. And then celebration. Pack members embraced. Someone started cheering. Within minutes, the chamber transformed into something close to a party. Justice had been served. The monster was vanquished. Frostfall could be proud. Eirwyn stood and walked out. No one noticed. She made it to the garden before her legs gave out. She sat on a stone bench and stared at her hands. Merith was gone. Punishment had been swift and public and satisfying for everyone watching. But nothing had actually changed. The system that had allowed 11 years of abuse still existed. The structures that made servants invisible were intact. The rules that valued efficiency over welfare remained unquestioned. They'd removed the symptom. The disease continued. "Eirwyn." She looked up. The 3 Alphas stood at the garden entrance, hesitant in a way she'd never seen them. "The council wants to speak with you," Braxton said. "To apologize formally. To offer," he stopped, "to offer you a place. As our mate. Our Luna." Eirwyn's heart stopped. "We know the timing is terrible," Thorn added quickly. "But we've felt it for years. The bond. We thought Merith was our mate, but it never settled right. And then today, when we saw you, we felt certainty," Isker finished. "You're our true mate. We should have recognized it years ago." They looked at her with desperate hope. 3 powerful Alphas offering everything they had. Protection, status, power, a complete reversal of her position. If she said yes, she would become Luna. Meritha's punishment would transform into a love story. The rejected Omega who became queen. Everyone would celebrate, and nothing would change. "I need time," Eirwyn said. "Of course," Braxton said immediately. "Whatever you need. Days, maybe weeks. Take months if necessary." Eirwyn stood. "I want to be clear about something. If I accept, it won't be to become your mate." They stared. "It will be to change what made this possible in the first place." She met their eyes. "Can you accept that?" Silence. Long and heavy. Finally, Isker spoke. "Yes. Even if it's uncomfortable? Even if it exposes your own failures?" "Yes," all 3 said. Eirwyn nodded. "Then ask me again in 3 days. I'll have an answer." She walked past them into the keep, leaving 3 Alpha Kings standing in a garden, finally understanding that justice and accountability were not the same thing. Would you accept power if it meant using it to dismantle the system that hurt you? 3 days felt like 3 years. Eirwyn spent them in the guest suite, thinking. Nissa visited twice daily to check her injuries. Kessa brought meals and sat with her, silent company that meant more than words. The Alphas sent letters. Not love confessions, requests for meetings, lists of proposed reforms, questions about what real change would require. They were trying. She could see that. But trying wasn't the same as understanding. On the third evening, Eirwyn finally descended to the private dining room where they'd asked to meet her. Braxen, Thorn, and Isker stood when she entered. They looked exhausted, like they'd spent 3 days wrestling with concepts that didn't have easy answers. "Thank you for coming," Braxen said. Eirwyn sat. They followed. "I've made my decision," she said. 3 faces turned toward her, expressions carefully neutral but eyes desperate. "I'll accept the bond. On conditions." "Anything," Thorn said immediately. "Wait until you hear them." Eirwyn pulled out a folded paper from her pocket. "I wrote them down, because this can't be emotional. It has to be structural." She unfolded the list. First, independent oversight for all Luna authority. A council position specifically tasked with servant welfare. Mandatory quarterly check-ins that can't be refused or delegated. Isker was already nodding. Done. Second, legal advocates assigned to unclaimed Omegas. Someone with actual authority who can file grievances without retaliation. "We'll establish the position immediately," Braxen said. Third, mandatory reporting protocols for any injuries to household staff. Medical examinations by healers who don't report to the Luna. Anonymous reporting systems. "Yes," all 3 said. Fourth, Eirwyn paused. This was the hard one. Historical audit. Every Luna who's served Frostfall in the last 50 years. Interview former servants. Investigate patterns. Make it public. Silence. "That will be ugly," Thorn said quietly. "It will expose us. Show how long this has been possible." "Yes. People will lose faith in our leadership." "Maybe they should." Braxen leaned forward. "If we do this, if we expose the system's failures this thoroughly, it will take years to rebuild trust." "Then rebuild it," Eirwyn said, "with systems that deserve trust this time." Isker was reading her list, his expression thoughtful. "You're not asking for revenge. You're asking for institutional reform. Revenge ends a story. Reform keeps it alive." "This will be uncomfortable," Braxen said. "Constant. People will resist." "I know. You'll face criticism. They'll say you're vindictive, that you're using your position for personal vendettas. Let them say it." Eirwyn met his eyes. "I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for every servant who learns to move silently so they don't get noticed. Every Omega who thinks endurance is the only option. Every person who exists in the margins of your perfectly ordered household." Thorn looked at his brothers. Some unspoken communication passed between them. "If we accept these conditions," Braxen said slowly, "it changes what this bond means. It won't be romance. It'll be partnership built on political reform. I know. You'd be our Luna, our mate, but the foundation would be accountability, not affection. Can you accept that?" Eirwyn asked. More silence. Then Isker smiled. Small, genuine, touched with something like respect. "Yes. It's not what we imagined," Thorn admitted. "But it's what we need." Braxen stood, approached her slowly, knelt again, meeting her eyes at the same level. "You're offering us a chance to be better leaders, better men." His voice was quiet. "Even after everything we failed to see, you're still believing we can change." "I'm betting on it," Eirwyn corrected. "There's a difference." "Will you accept our bond?" he asked formally. "Not as submission, as partnership." Eirwyn looked at the 3 of them. Flawed, fallible, powerful men who'd missed something catastrophic happening under their own roof. But they were listening now, really listening. "I need to say something first," she said. They waited. "If I accept this bond, and we build these reforms and nothing changes," she paused, "I'll leave. I'll walk away, and I'll make sure everyone knows why." "Understood," Braxen said. "I mean it. This isn't a fairy tale. This is work. Constant, Uncomfortable, thankless work that will expose every failure. We understand, Iskair said. Do you? Eirwyn stood. Because what you're offering me isn't just power. It's the platform to dismantle everything that made you comfortable. Your traditions, your assumptions, your certainty that the way things have always been is the way they should stay. We know, Thorn said, and we're asking you to do it anyway. Eirwyn took a breath, let herself feel the weight of the choice. Then she spoke one sentence that changed the room. I accept. The bond snapped into place immediately, a recognition that had been waiting for years. But it felt different than the stories suggested. Not completion, not destiny, just 3 people and 1 Omega committing to something harder than love. They committed to change. If you could rewrite the rules that hurt you, where would you start? The first reform meeting happened at dawn. Eirwyn sat at the council table. Not behind it, not serving it, but at it, with the 3 alphas and 5 council members who looked like they'd swallowed glass. The historical audit begins today, she said, sliding her proposal across polished wood. Every former servant from the past 50 years. Documented interviews. Published findings. Counselor Davrin cleared his throat. Luna, perhaps we should start with smaller changes. Ease the pack into. No. Her voice was quiet but absolute. We start with truth. Everything else builds from there. Braxton nodded. The audit proceeds as proposed. The resistance was immediate. Wolves who'd served under previous Lunas suddenly had concerns about privacy, about dredging up the past, about damaging Frostfall's reputation. Eirwyn listened to every objection with the same patient attention she'd once given to council debates she wasn't supposed to understand. Then she spoke. Reputation built on hidden suffering isn't reputation. It's performance. She met each council member's eyes. We're done performing. Iskair distributed copies of the new oversight protocols. Thorn outlined the independent advocate positions. Braxton presented the mandatory reporting systems. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, 3 council members had resigned. They'll speak against you, Thorn warned as they left. Let them, Eirwyn said. Their opposition proves why this is necessary. She spent the afternoon in the servants' wing, a place she'd lived for 11 years but never had authority to change. Kessa walked with her, pointing out the cramped quarters, the insufficient heating, the single bathing room for 30 staff. We always just managed, Kessa said quietly. You shouldn't have had to. Eirwyn made notes. This gets fixed. All of it. Word spread quickly. The new Luna was different. She asked questions. She listened. She'd been one of them. Some servants looked at her with hope, others with suspicion, a few with resentment. Her elevation highlighting their continued invisibility. Eirwyn understood all of it. That evening, the bond pulled her toward the Alpha's private quarters. She'd been avoiding it, sleeping in the guest suite, maintaining distance. But the bond was insistent, not demanding, just present. She found them in their shared study, surrounded by reports and reform proposals. You don't have to do this alone, Braxton said when he saw her. I'm not alone. I have you 3. She paused. I'm just not ready for. We know. Thorn's smile was gentle. The bond isn't about obligation. It's about choice. Iskair looked up from his reading. We spent 11 years not seeing you. We can wait however long you need to decide if you want to be seen. Something in Eirwyn's chest loosened. The historical audit, she said, changing the subject. We found 12 former servants willing to testify. Their stories are... Her voice caught. We'll hear them, Braxton said. All of them. And we'll respond with action, not just apologies. Eirwyn sat in the chair they'd left empty for her. For the first time in 11 years, sitting felt like belonging instead of strategic invisibility. This is going to get worse before it gets better, she said. We know, all 3 replied. People will fight us. They'll say we're destroying tradition. Tradition that required your silence, Iskair said, deserves to be destroyed. Eirwyn pulled out her journal. No longer hidden, no longer secret. She opened it to a blank page. "Then let's document how we rebuild," she said. And for the first time, she wasn't writing alone. What does real change look like when it's just beginning? 6 months later, Eirwyn stood in the renovated servants' wing and watched young wolves move into quarters that had heating, proper beds, and dignity. The historical audit had been published 3 weeks ago. The findings were devastating. For previous Lunas with documented patterns of abuse, dozens of servants who'd learned the same survival techniques Eirwyn had mastered. Frostfall's reputation had taken the hit Braxton predicted, and something unexpected happened. Other packs started asking questions. The Silverpine Luna had written personally, requesting copies of the reforms. The Eastern Ridge Alpha had visited to observe the new oversight systems. 3 smaller packs had implemented similar advocate positions. "You're starting something," Nissa said, joining her at the window. "I'm just making visible what was always there. That's how all movements start." Eirwyn turned. "It's not enough yet. The structures are there, but culture changes slower. Give it time." Time. Eirwyn had been given 11 years of the wrong kind of time. Now she had the chance to use it differently. The bond with the Alphas had deepened gradually, naturally. Not romance from a story, but partnership built through late-night reform meetings and difficult conversations and the slow work of learning to trust. She'd moved into their quarters last month. Not because the bond demanded it, but because she'd chosen to. That choice mattered. Braxton found her in the library that evening, shelving books, a habit she couldn't break. "You don't have to do that anymore," he said gently. "I know. I want to." She looked at him. "This room taught me how power works. Seems right to tend it." He moved closer, careful not to crowd. The council approved the education initiative. Omegas can access full schooling regardless of designation. Eirwyn felt tears prick her eyes. "That means no more lost futures at 16. He took her hand, the one with the scar across the palm. "Because of you. Because we all chose to look. You made us look," he corrected. "You could have accepted the bond and stopped there. Instead, you demanded we become worthy of it." Eirwyn leaned into him, feeling the bond hum with contentment. Not completion, just recognition. Later, in the quarters she now shared, Thorn asked the question she'd been expecting. "Do you regret it? Choosing reform over romance?" "They're not separate," Eirwyn said. "This is my romance. Building something that protects people like I was." Isker smiled from his chair. "You're changing the world through policy reform. It's possibly the least traditional love story ever." "Good," Eirwyn said. "Traditional is what hurt me." She pulled out her journal, now kept openly on the desk. The pages documented progress and setbacks, victories and ongoing struggles. The final entry read, Year 1 of Reconstruction. 12 packs adopting reforms. 400 servants with new protections. 3 alphas learning that love means accountability. 1 omega learning that survival can transform into purpose. She closed the journal and looked at her mates. "What happens next?" "We keep working," Braxton said. "We keep listening," Thorn added. "We keep changing," Isker finished. Eirwyn nodded. The gray dress still hung in her closet, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of where she'd been. She wore blue now, and red, and gold. But more importantly, she wore authority built on the certainty that power and used to protect the vulnerable was just another form of abuse. The story didn't end with punishment. It didn't end with romance. It ended with 3 alphas and 1 omega choosing, every single day, to build something better than what came before. And in the margins of a pack learning to see its own failures, Eirwyn finally found what she'd been documenting all along. Not escape, not revenge, but the radical possibility that pain could become purpose, if you refuse to let it end with you. The best endings are just new beginnings wearing different clothes.